Alright guys, today we are going to start our chapter on the Constitution. So I want to start off by saying the Constitution, it was written in 1787, it doesn't take effect until 1789. The fact that the Constitution is more than 200 years old does not mean, however, that now in the 21st century it is only an interesting historical artifact fit for museums and dusty shelves. It remains a vitally important and vibrant document today. It is the nation's fundamental law. It is, by its own terms, the supreme law of the land, the highest form of law in the United States. And to start us off talking about the Constitution, we're going to look at some of the basic principles of it. The Constitution then is built on these principles, and there are 6. Popular sovereignty, limited government, separation of powers, checks and balances, judicial review, and federalism. And we'll be looking at each of these in detail. Okay, so again, Constitution sets out basic principles upon which the government in the United States was built and operates today. It is just over 7,000 words, and it can be read in under 30 minutes. Parts of the Constitution, we've talked a great deal about the preamble. This is just an introduction to the document. It's very short, and it states some of the purposes of the document. So, for example, it talks about establishing justice. It also talks about peace and general welfare, liberty, and so on and so on. Then there is the Articles of the Constitution. It's divided into 7 parts. It outlines the basic organization and powers of each branch of government. The Articles also gives guidance on how to amend, ratify, and use the Constitution so that it can continue to be a flexible and effective document today. So just to kind of give you an idea, in Article 1 of the Constitution, it talks about the legislative branch. Article 2 talks about the executive. Article 3, the judicial branch. Article 4, relations among the states. Article 5 talks about amending the Constitution or adding amendments to the Constitution. Article 6 talks about national debts, supremacy of national law, or the Supremacy Clause, the oaths of office. And then, last but not least, Article 7 talks about ratifying the Constitution. So just understand that the Constitution, again, is the supreme law of the land. And that simply means that it is the highest form of law in the United States, and it stands above everything else. So this slide here just shows the various articles of the Constitution, and again, what is included in each. Remember that the legislative branch makes the laws. This is Congress, and there are 2 houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate. And also remember that because of the Great Compromise, we have a bicameral legislature, and the Senate is based on equality, which is 2 per state, and then the House of Representatives is based on the population within your state. Executive branch enforces the laws. This is where you will see the president, vice president, and then judicial interprets the law. This would be like the Supreme Court. The 7 articles of the document are followed by 27 amendments printed in order in which they are adopted. And obviously 1 through 10 are the Bill of Rights. Alright, so again, the 6 principles of the Constitution. Popular sovereignty, this just means rule by the people, or that the people essentially are the power of the government, that we should have a say, that we should rule, and our voices should be heard. Federalism, this simply means that power is divided between the state and national government. That this is a shared power, that there are certain powers for the state, and that there are certain powers for the national government. And then there are even powers that are concurrent powers, meaning both the state and national government have those powers. Separation of powers, this just means that we have 3 branches of government: executive, judicial, and legislative. And they are separate and independent of one another, however, they are equal in power. Checks and balances. This is a system put in place that ensures that no one branch becomes too powerful. It gives each branch the ability to check the other two when they possibly begin to abuse their power. This will check them and bring them back down. Judicial review. This is the power of the courts to declare laws invalid if they violate the Constitution. So this basically gives the Supreme Court to decide if a law is constitutional or if it is unconstitutional. Limited government. The Constitution limits the actions of government by specifically listing powers it does and does not have. Okay, so just a little bit more detail here. Popular sovereignty. Again, all political power resides in the people. They are the only source for any and all government power. The opening words, "We the people" of the preamble, basically outline popular sovereignty and give the power to the people. This shows that the people of the United States own the power. So essentially, where did this idea come from? First and foremost, the Declaration of Independence. Obviously, this is where we talk about wanting to separate from Great Britain. We talk about how the power should be coming from the people of the 13 American colonies, not from Great Britain. What other constitutions hold this idea? State constitutions also held this idea that the power should come from the people within that state. And so we kind of used it and took it from those two documents and implemented it into our Constitution. Limited government. No government is all-powerful. That a government may do only those things that the people have given it the power to do. Government must obey the laws so stated in the Constitution, meaning that no one is above the law, and that the government is limited in what it can do. And in the Constitution, it specifies what the government can and cannot do. This idea comes from rule of law, and this just means that the government, its officers, are always subject and never above the law. It also comes from the idea of constitutionalism, which is when the government must be conducted according to constitutional principles. They must follow the principles just as everyone else. Separation of powers. This is power that is distributed between the three branches of government so that no one branch can become too powerful. They are individual powers and independent powers. Each article specifically spells out what that branch is allowed to do. A strong government was wanted, but we also wanted one with limits. We didn't want it to be able to abuse its power, and that's why we put the checks and balances system in place, which we'll talk about in the next slide. So separation of powers, a little more detail. What is a parliamentary government? This is the type of government that is in Great Britain, where a prime minister is chosen by a legislative branch, and then people elect that legislative branch. Presidential form of government. This is what we have here in the U.S. The president is chosen by the people in the Electoral College, and the legislative branch is chosen also by the people. So we choose both the legislative body and the people, whereas in Great Britain, the people elect the legislative branch, but they don't actually choose the prime minister. The legislative branch does. So this gives you a little bit better image, and I think we've talked a little bit about this already, but again, this is the type of government that we have. So voters vote on the legislative branch. They vote also on the chief executive. Where here in in Great Britain, the voters actually vote for the legislative branch, and then the legislative branch then chooses the chief executive. So essentially, all the power is held in one agency in Great Britain, whereas here in the U.S., it's distributed amongst legislative, executive, and judicial as well. Remember, the framers of the Constitution intended to create a stronger government for the United States, yet they also intended to limit the powers of the government. The doctrine of separation of powers was designed to that end. So under the Articles of Confederation, remember, it was a very weak government. It didn't work. Congress didn't have the power to tax, to raise an army, and so on and so on. And so we had to create something that gave the national government a little bit more power, but not too much power. Because if we gave them too much power, then we might see a monarchy or a dictatorship emerge. And so we put the three branches of government in place to separate powers. We put the checks and balances in place to check those powers, to make sure no one branch raised above the other and abused its power, and again, formed some sort of monarchy or dictatorship that we did not want. Checks and balances. So again, all three branches have a complex system in which they may check the other branches. For example, a president may veto or reject any law Congress passes. Congress has the ability to override a veto with 2/3 majority vote in Senate. It takes 67 votes. Supreme Court, judicial branch may rule a law passed to be unconstitutional. That's kind of their power. When making important decisions, each branch keeps in mind the power of the other. So when passing a law, Congress keeps in mind that the president's power, or the power the president has to possibly veto. This chart here just kind of outlines some of the powers of each branch of government, kind of the checks they have on one another, and we'll be diving into a little bit more of these checks with an assignment coming up. This chart also specifies, again, some of those checks that each branch has on the other. So, for example, as far as the executive branch, the legislative branch can propose laws. The judicial branch can appoint federal judges. For legislative branch, the executive branch can override the president's veto. Judicial can create lower federal courts. For judicial, the executive branch can declare executive actions unconstitutional, can declare acts of Congress unconstitutional. All right, and then the last two here, judicial review, courts have the ability to rule when government does not follow the Constitution or create laws which are not in line with the Constitution. The power to declare unconstitutional. So judicial review, essentially, this is various court cases that we see. So most recently we talked about Texas versus Johnson with the burning of the American flag. And so again, the Supreme Court has the ability to hear these cases and then make decisions about them and decide whether it violates your First Amendment. And obviously with the flag burning, the government held that this violated your First Amendment right. Federalism, this is again the division of power among a certain government and several regional governments. So a division between national and state governments, and that they share that power. And in short, they construct the federal arrangement with its division of power as a compromise, not giving too much power to individual states or to the central government. Understand that unconstitutional, I should have said this earlier, but unconstitutional just means to declare illegal, null or void. And that judicial review power comes from the federal courts and state courts.